You've done the responsible thing. You built an emergency fund, 6 months of expenses sitting in a savings account, just like every financial expert told you to, and yet somehow you still feel stuck. You're not broke, but you're not moving forward either. Your money just sits there, technically safe, technically smart, and completely frozen, while inflation quietly eats away at it every single month. Something doesn't add up. If the safe advice was supposed to set you free, why does it feel like a cage? Here's an uncomfortable truth almost nobody in personal finance wants to say out loud. The 6 month emergency fund, the sacred rule that gets repeated in every article, every podcast, every well meaning conversation with your parents, might actually be one of the biggest reasons regular people stay stuck in the middle instead of building real wealth. My name is AAU, and I spend way too much time thinking about why financial advice that sounds responsible on paper often quietly sabotages people in practice. If you've ever followed the rules and still felt like you weren't getting anywhere, this video is going to reframe a lot of what you thought you knew. Hit subscribe if that sounds like something you need right now. Let's start with where this rule even came from because understanding its origin is the key to understanding why it's outdated for so many people. The 6 month rule was popularized decades ago, back when job loss meant a longer, murkier hiring process, when unemployment benefits were harder to access quickly, and when most households only had one income stream to lean on. It was designed as a blanket rule for a world that doesn't fully exist anymore. It wasn't built for you specifically, it was built for the average person in an average situation using average assumptions. And blanket rules built for averages often fail spectacularly for individuals. Think about a highway with a speed limit sign. That number wasn't calculated for your car, your tires, your reflexes, or the weather on the exact day you're driving. It's a rough estimate meant to keep the average driver, in average conditions, reasonably safe. Some days that number's way too conservative. Some days it's not conservative enough. The 6 month emergency fund is the financial equivalent of that speed limit sign. It's not wrong, exactly, it's just not calibrated to you. Here's where the psychology gets interesting, and this is the part most people never stop to examine. Once you hit that 6 month number, something strange happens in your brain. You feel done, finished, like you've crossed the finish line of financial responsibility. But that finish line was never actually the finish line. It was supposed to be the starting block for wealth building, and instead, for a huge number of people, it becomes a resting place where money goes to stop growing. Let's talk about what that money is actually doing while it sits there. A typical high yield savings account right now pays somewhere around 4 to 5% interest. Sounds decent on the surface, but inflation, even in a calm year, tends to run close to that same range, which means your 6 month fund, sitting there feeling safe and responsible, is often barely breaking even against the rising cost of everything around it. In a bad inflation year, it's actively losing purchasing power while you sleep. You didn't lose money in your bank statement, you lost money in what that money can actually buy you. Now compare that to what the same money could be doing in a diversified index fund averaging historical returns closer to 8 to 10% annually. Let's run the actual math because this is where it stops being theoretical and starts being personal. Say your 6 month expenses come out to $18,000. If that sits in a savings account earning 4.5%, after 10 years you'd have roughly $27,900. If instead $12,000 of that same fund sat in the market at a historical 9% average, while you kept a leaner $6,000 buffer in cash for true short term shocks, that $12,000 alone would grow to approximately $28,400 in that same decade. And that's before you've added a single additional dollar. Same starting point, same person, same discipline. Wildly different outcome just because of where the money was allowed to live. This is the part that should genuinely frustrate you because the sacrifice required to build that fund was identical either way. You still had to cut expenses. You still had to say no to things. You still had to delay gratification for months, sometimes years. The work was the same, the reward was not. So why does everyone still preach the 6 month number like it's gospel? Because fear sells safety and safety sells easily. Nobody gets criticized for being too cautious. Financial advisors, worried about liability, default to the most conservative advice possible because if something goes wrong, "I told you to be extra safe" is a much easier sentence to say than "I told you to take a calculated risk." The advice isn't malicious, it's just built for covering downside, not for maximizing your actual life. Here's where we need to introduce a completely different way of thinking about this, something you're not going to hear from mainstream financial content. Instead of a flat 6-month rule, what if your emergency fund was actually calibrated to your real risk profile? Because here's the truth nobody says out loud. Not everyone needs the same buffer. If you're a government employee with strong job security and a spouse who also works in a stable field, your actual risk of sudden dual unemployment is dramatically lower than someone freelancing in a volatile industry with a single income and dependents relying on them. Treating both of these people identically, telling them both to freeze the same 6 months in cash, is financial malpractice disguised as caution. Think about it through the lens of insurance, because that's really what an emergency fund is. It's self insurance against disaster. And nobody buys more insurance than their actual risk requires, at least not intentionally. You don't insure a 10-year-old economy car for the same amount as a brand new luxury vehicle because the actual exposure is different. Yet somehow we've collectively agreed that every single person, regardless of job stability, income diversity, health, or family structure, needs to freeze the exact same multiple of their expenses. That's not personalized risk management. That's a slogan. So, what does a smarter approach actually look like? For most people with stable dual incomes, decent job security, and no major health complications, somewhere between 2 and 3 months of expenses in true cash reserves covers the vast majority of realistic short term shocks. Car repairs, minor medical bills, a brief gap between jobs, the kind of stuff that actually happens statistically. The remaining months of safety that traditional advice tells you to freeze can instead be deployed, not recklessly, but strategically, into a mix of investments that still maintains liquidity but actually grows. This is where the identity shift needs to happen. And it's the same identity shift that separates people who accumulate wealth from people who just accumulate savings. You have to stop thinking of your emergency fund as a permanent monument and start thinking of it as a temporary staging area. Money passes through it, it doesn't retire there. Here's the part that will probably annoy you because it exposes just how much unnecessary anxiety gets baked into this whole topic. The emergency fund isn't actually protecting you from the emergencies people picture when they build it. Most people imagine total job loss, total income collapse, months of zero income while they scramble. But statistically, that's not the most common emergency at all. The most common financial shocks are car repairs, appliance failures, medical copays, and short income gaps of a few weeks. Situations that a leaner 2 or 3 month buffer handles perfectly well. You've been over insuring against a disaster movie scenario while under optimizing your actual, statistically likely reality. Let's bring in the career angle here too, because this connects directly to something we've talked about before on this channel. Confidence at work doesn't come from having 6 months frozen in a savings account. It comes from having a growing net worth, from watching your investments compound, from knowing that even if you had to walk away from a job, you have real, growing assets behind you, not just a stagnant cash pile losing value to inflation. Walking away money doesn't have to sit in a savings account earning nothing real. It can sit in appreciating assets that you could liquidate if truly necessary, while growing the rest of the time. Now, I need to be very clear about something, because I don't want this video to be misheard as throw caution to the wind. This isn't permission to keep zero cash reserves and gamble everything in the market. That's a different trap entirely, and an even more dangerous one. The point isn't to eliminate your buffer, the point is to right size it to your actual life instead of blindly following a number designed for someone else's circumstances. Here's a simple mental framework you can actually use. Ask yourself 3 questions. How stable is my income, really? Do I have one income stream or multiple? And how quickly could I realistically replace lost income in my specific field? If your answers point toward high stability, a leaner buffer with the rest invested makes mathematical sense. If your answers point toward volatility, a fatter cash cushion is genuinely the right call. And there's no shame in that. This isn't about being aggressive for the sake of it. It's about matching your safety net to your actual life instead of a generic script. And here's the mindset shift that changes everything once you actually internalize it. Every extra month of expenses sitting idle beyond what your real risk profile requires isn't safety. It's opportunity cost quietly compounding against you in the background, year after year, invisible on your bank statement but very real in your future net worth. Think back to that highway metaphor. The safest driver on the road isn't the one blindly obeying a generic sign, regardless of conditions. It's the one who actually understands their vehicle, their skill level, and the road in front of them, and adjusts accordingly. Financial safety works the exact same way. Blind rule following feels responsible, but true financial maturity means understanding your own risk well enough to calibrate the rule to yourself instead of shrinking your future to fit someone else's formula. So here's what I want you to actually do with this. Don't panic and yank your entire emergency fund into the market tomorrow. That's not the lesson here. Sit down, honestly assess your real risk profile, income stability, number of income streams, industry volatility, family responsibilities, and figure out your actual number. For a lot of people, that number is smaller than 6 months. For some people, it's larger. But almost nobody stops to ask the question in the first place, because the 6-month rule feels so official that questioning it feels irresponsible. It isn't irresponsible, it's the opposite. The truly responsible move is understanding why a rule exists before you follow it blindly, and adjusting it when your actual life doesn't match the assumptions baked into it, because the goal was never just to feel safe. The goal was always to build a life where your money is actually working as hard as you are. Start there. Do the actual math for your situation instead of borrowing someone else's number. Your future self is the one who inherits whatever decision you make right now, and they deserve better than a rule that was never built with them in mind.